Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1030 just came out, and we have a lot to talk about with this chapter. I was actually spoiled on this chapter. A lot of spoilers were going around on Twitter. I could not avoid being spoiled. I was spoiled on this chapter, and that actually helped because it made me come into the chapter with lower expectations. I don't know how many of you read the spoilers, but the spoilers basically made it sound borderline as though Kid and Law essentially had their awakenings off screen earlier in the Big Mom fight when we didn't get to see, and then they just one-shotted Big Mom this chapter. That is obviously not what happened, so when I actually read the chapter, things were not as abrupt as the spoilers made it seem. So the chapter was actually more enjoyable because I came in with really worried expectations. So, taking things from the top, the numbers just became an interesting part of Onigashima. I did not think I would ever say that sentence, but the numbers are now an interesting part of Onigashima because I don't know how many of you saw this going around on Twitter. There are strong, striking, practically undeniable visual similarities between those three numbers and the three samurai that were in the cave with Yamato. As far as I understand, those are numbers 1, 2, and 3. My Japanese isn't so hot, so maybe I got them a little wrong, but I think that would make sense. I also think it would be interesting if Oda kind of had the number system as something along the lines of, the traditional countdown, 10 is the weakest, get it down to 1 is the strongest, might be an interesting way to do it. Or alternatively, maybe those three were the first numbers that were created for Kaido's crew. Now we understand, we always knew that the numbers were science experiments essentially that were carried out to turn soldiers into giant monsters to fight for Kaido, right? But what we didn't know is that it seems as though it's soldiers that Kaido likely tried to break in the past, because that's what Kaido likes to do. And if he fails, then he decides to turn them into numbers. That's at least the gist of what I'm getting from this scenario, right? So the three samurai that Kaido put in the cave, that refused to break, that actually came out of the cave and tried to fight him once again, it seems as though Kaido actually decided to just turn them into numbers, and they became his first attempts at super soldiers. That would be really, really interesting if that is the case. I wonder how strong these numbers are at this point. If they still retain their previous samurai fighting skill to a degree, that would be insane. Considering one of them is Shimotsuki Ushimaru, who is 95% chance some relative of Zoro's, right? And rest in peace, the Shimotsuki Ushimaru Green Bull theory. Hello to the new theory that Green Bull's his son, basically, and Shimotsuki Ushimaru is actually Zoro's grandfather, because that's the next step. Still feel that there's some connection there. But the point being that with the numbers, it's very reminiscent to me of the Smile situation, right? So with the Smile, something that at first glance isn't particularly alarming or, strange. So, we initially see there's a village of people who seem to constantly smile and laugh at every little thing, and then slowly we find out that it's the result of a twisted science experiment stemming from Kaido and Orochi's rule over the country, right? Similar thing with the numbers. Oh, looks like some giant badass warriors under Kaido's crew. Over time we start to realize that, okay, these seem to be science experiments by Kaido, and now we seem to be realizing that they're unwilling science experiments by Kaido, so actually opponents of his that he has decided to turn into his personal guinea pigs for super soldier experiments, right? So I think that, and they clearly lose a huge semblance of their actual personality, free will, and general consciousness, at least from how we see the numbers behave. So, twisted stuff all around. I'm liking the fact that the further we go into Wano, the more this sort of idea that was planted all the way back from Punk Hazard, to be honest, which makes sense as that was the origins of this entire storyline, right? Punk Hazard through Wano. This idea of essentially using people as guinea pigs for these villains' twisted science experiments, that's been a running trend from Caesar Clown all the way up to right now with the Beast Pirates. So a lot of that, I guess, is still assuming that those three numbers are the three samurai, but it's go look at go look at it. It seems almost undeniable. It's almost like there's no other reason to even focus in on those three numbers and have them present during Apu and X-Drake's meeting. If they just turn out to be three random numbers, then just ignore everything I just said in this section. But it does seem like that definitely is the case. It's almost like Oda really isn't trying to hide it. Now, beyond that, Apu and X-Drake, okay, interesting stuff. I expected a full-on fight between the two to play out, but, alliance forming, it's hard to see where that goes exactly. I do have that long-running theory. If you go check my video on why I believe Killer will die, I do have that long-running theory that Kid is essentially going to eventually unite many of the supernovas underneath him, which, this Apu x Drake alliance could be a stepping stone towards heading towards a larger supernova alliance. So I like that possibility, but obviously this is, a very loose connection to that possibility. It's just two supernovas teaming together, and that's obviously gone so well in the past. So anyway, interesting beginning of the chapter. Middle of the chapter is where I wonder how people feel about the middle of the chapter, because the middle of the chapter, look, I never thought Kinemon was dead. Because to me, the Kinemon death scene, it was not, there are scenes like the Pound death scene, right? Where it feels like Oda really, 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 really tries to make you believe. Like, he checks off all the boxes. Pound should be dead, right? Oda checks off all the boxes. He does everything he possibly can to make you believe that Pound is dead. And he's trying to get the dramatic weight out of that scene, right? Of a character death, okay? So Pound is a character that seemed 100%, 115% should have died, and then Oda just brought him back. With Kinemon, that felt more like Oda's sort of traditional cliffhanger sort of death scenes where, the character's not actually dead. It's just kind of putting him in a position where it's like, okay, they should be dead, but he didn't really linger on the scene that long. He didn't devote an entire chapter to it like we would expect him to. He kind of glossed over the ending bit of it. So Kinemon was a scene where it was more like, okay, Kinemon's putting his life on the line. He's attempting this sacrifice, but I didn't come away from it thinking that, okay, Oda's trying to definitely make us feel like Kinemon just died, okay? So Kinemon's death, Kinemon not being dead, that's fine in my book. The whole lower body, upper body thing, we'll get to that in a second. I think Kiku's death and Kanjuro's death, so Kiku, it sounds like very much is still alive and can be saved. Kiku's death and Kanjuro's death, I don't get why those two are alive, because Oda really spent a lot of time. Those two felt very much framed to me as though these are Kiku's last, like this is the end for Kiku, right? This is her poetic death, right? Her poetic, she's talking about snow and stuff. I don't recall her exact monologue, but she gives a soliloquy, essentially, right? Like that's, I don't know what else to say. With the Kiku death, I think just, I'm surprised that Kiku is alive. I think that one's rough. Kanjuro, if this really is his last breath, then sure. But with Kiku, I don't know, it just makes that whole scene, which is already kind of like an iffy scene, depending on like how much you think Oda earned that sort of poetic, snowy monologue on her deathbed, for the character, how much that actually even hit in the first place, and now to find out that wasn't even a thing. I don't know. I did not like the fact that Kiku is still alive. I think that was the one that bothered me. Kanjuro, if this is his last breath. Okay, so Fire Demon. Now, with the Fire Demon, I think that's pretty interesting because it kind of goes back to how we were first introduced to the idea of Kanjuro the traitor with that imagery of essentially this monster. So I don't know if this monster is a bit of a manifestation of how he feels inside or something along those lines, or if it's, how do I say this? If it's kind of just like, because the first time we were introduced to Kanjuro, that is what he looked like, right? So I don't know if that was kind of, when I say first time introduced, I'm mixing my things up here. First time we were introduced to Kanjuro in the context of a flashback that Orochi was of Orochi bringing a traitor into his fold, right? That was the imagery we were given for Kanjuro, right? So does Kanjuro use that sort of painting of a sort of fire demon as, his front to interact with Orochi, or is this more so just visually symbolic that the same Kanjuro, like the real Kanjuro at that time, right? So the Kanjuro we have right now is essentially an actor, an image that he's put on, but the image of Kanjuro back then as this sort of shadowy, hazy figure that's talking to Orochi, that was the real Kanjuro, essentially a man without form, right? Who is willing to take on any form. So we could view that as essentially the equivalent of the fire demon that's coming out right now. So that essentially being a manifestation of Kanjuro himself, right? So Kanjuro essentially drawing a fire demon in the form of himself, his true self, if that makes sense. Which is interesting to think about. And I think that would be fitting for, a curtain call or whatever for the character. Now, the fire demon in general, I think it's interesting that I've said interesting so many times this chapter review. Gotta cut that out. I think it's what's the other word for it? I think it's cool that there's a fire demon traveling through Onigashima at this point, because in my mind, if the fire demon's goal is to get to the explosives and Yamato's goal is to get to the explosives, Yamato has ice-based abilities. I think it would be interesting. I think it would be great to see Yamato get a matchup that I guess we're not really expecting. Who would have thought that Yamato would be fighting some fire demon? But I think it would be great to see Yamato at least exercise some of her ice-based abilities against one final opponent for her before this section of the arc essentially ends, because Kaido was a good fight, but we obviously got to understand by the end of it that Yamato couldn't really do that much to Kaido, and really Kaido is Luffy's fight. So Yamato's still getting something on the way to disarming the bombs is a good idea, because I do think that just Yamato going and just disarming the bombs doesn't make for much of a storyline, right? So this does add some potential tension to that, a bit of a more significant obstacle for Yamato to occur, as well as, I suppose, the fire demon adding to the general increasing tension or attempt to increase tension in the atmosphere for Onigashima. Obviously, the fire was already going, but, well, you added some more fire, so maybe things get a little more serious from here on. Now, with the Straughts, we got to check in with everybody. Everyone's basically where we last saw them in the middle of their fights. The only thing is Sanji is now actually fighting back against Queen a little bit, which I like to see, because if it was just him indefinitely running from Queen, that would be a little strange for where we're at, in the climax of this huge battle. And Momonosuke is already on his way to at least getting there towards creating the clouds, right? I assume that it's hard to tell how far off we are from Onigashima coming down, because we did get a cut to the people in the Flower Capital, and they seem perfectly fine with everything that's going on. So I don't know how many have even noticed Onigashima above them. Maybe it's so high above them that it's obscured by the clouds. Maybe it's right above them at this point and they can't even tell because it's obscured by the clouds. That's entirely possible. We do know it's a cloudy night. That's why the Minks had some trouble at one point with busting out their Sulong form to Luffy split the sky. So Onigashima, I don't really know what the timeline is on that. There is that interesting theory by Uteron that 1031, the meaning of those numbers means heavenly descent, so potentially Onigashima coming down, in which case, that's possibly next chapter that Onigashima would come down, but Momonosuke would have to stop it. I think we're kind of close to that point where that would make sense in the story. So besides that, we have Kid and Law versus Big Mom. Now, them having Awakening, I think, is not that strange. I think that because generally Oda's preferred route is to hold back on revealing what power... I guess, how do I say this? Yeah, I think Oda in general, he prefers revealing the power-up that you... How do I say this? Okay, I feel like generally if a character has worked on a power-up off-screen, so say an Ashura, say a Diablo Jambe, say Gear 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. Oda prefers to keep that a secret and reveal that during the fight, and I think that's always been fine, and we've always been fine with that in One Piece. So, I think that's that. I think that the flip side is that, the other thing that Oda started introducing more recently is essentially building up to a power-up during the middle of the fight. So, for example, Advanced Conqueror's Haki, Advanced Observation Haki, and Haki Blooms in battle, so that makes more sense. Honestly, Luffy training his Armament Haki in Udon was one of the few times I can think of throughout the story that we actually legitimately got really, maybe the only... I might be missing something, but really one of, if not the only times in the story I can think of where we actually saw a character train and we knew exactly what power-up they had going into the battle, okay? Because, yeah, they all trained in the time skip, but that was all off screen. So we didn't actually know what they developed during the time skip. We got to find that out in increments afterwards. So all that is to say that Kid and Law, having gotten their awakenings, at some point leading up to this battle, not too surprising. That's, I think, fine. I think the one thing that is a little different is that I think Oda usually does a really, really good job making that power-up reveal very climactic. So building up to that over the course of the fight to then have the character busted out. So, for example, Luffy's gear 2nd, Luffy's gear 4th, Luffy's gear 3rd, Ashura, Diable Jambe, even over the course of this battle, Nico Robin breaking out her new devil form, right? There was a really nice buildup of events and, general little flashbacks and, sort of little, not essentially a speech, but like a bit of a buildup, through what she was saying, what she was doing, how the battle was going, essentially, right? And she gave a little bit of a speech leading up to the moment of reveal of like, this is everything coming together from me, from my time skip, from how I feel about my friends, from what I need to do, essentially, right? All of that leading up to first the slap, right? So the big slap move that she did, knocking Black Maria up into the ceiling, and then obviously breaking out the devil form. So I thought that, that to me felt like classic Oda, the way that he would unveil a big power-up like that. I did think that Kid and Law's power-up, the awakening, if that's their main thing, that it's just not Oda-like to me, the way that he did it. In that it was kind of just like, hey, you got awakening, bro? Yeah, I got awakening, bro. Okay, cool. Let's just do this. So that was the thing that felt off to me personally about this chapter, just because in general I think Oda's really, really good at building up to really climactic, memorable moments when these sort of power-ups are unveiled. So I don't have a problem whatsoever with Kid and Law having awakening and that having been something they worked on. I don't even have a problem with this chapter at all. It's just that I think it's more so just a surprise at Oda kind of doing it this way, which is not typical of him. Now, for their awakenings themselves, I think Kid and, okay, let's start with Law's, as I understand it, it seems to me that he's coating his sword with Room, essentially, and then to me it seems as though he's the initial shot, the upgraded it's not upgraded injection shot, right? That's not what it is, but to me it seems as though he's essentially injecting his opponent with the properties of his Room, or either injecting a Room into them or injecting some properties of Room into them so that now he can actually operate directly into the opponent in some way. That's at least what it seems to me. It seems like some sort of injection of Room or Room-like properties. So that's one. That's really broke. I guess the one drawback is that it's not as automatic as, say, Kid's ability, where Kid can just say assign, and then he assigns magnetism to someone as their trait. But Law does have to essentially inject the person initially, but once he injects them, it looks like he can pretty much do whatever he wants to them. At least that's what it seemed from the one panel of combat we saw from him this chapter. I wonder if Law could have just done it himself. Take it, well, I don't know. I'll give Big Mom more credit than that. But I'm wondering, if once Law gets someone, by surprise or whatever with his ability, I wonder how many characters can really even combat it, because it does seem like Law can just operate freely on the person, or at least do certain attacks to the person that they have almost no way of guarding. Okay, and we haven't seen him have to go back and forth with Big Mom on this just yet, so maybe there are things that she could be doing to counteract it, but we have yet to see that. Now, Kid's ability, essentially being able to assign magnetism to an opponent, that's more, that's less hacks, as we say, that's less hacks. It's less of a broken ability, but it's still a really, really, really powerful ability, right? I think really, really powerful depending on certain contexts. So if you're fighting on a sandy beach or something, that's probably not going to help. Actually, I don't know. Is there a lot of metal in sand that I don't know about? If you're fighting on a grassy plain, it's not going to be that great, right? But in this context, fighting in Onigashima, a giant fortress, yeah, I think the amount of metal that is being piled on Big Mom, it's clearly probably going to slow down even her, even like a freak physical force of nature that she is. So you can see the use of both these abilities, and the big thing with Kid's ability that gives it an advantage over Law's, as I see it, is that I don't know how you really stop it, right? Once you're a magnet, it just seems like you're a magnet. So both of these abilities, and Kid could just wave his hand, right? What I mean is, I don't know how you stop the initiation of the ability, right? Law at least seems like he has to inject the opponent with his room. Karoom. Whereas with Kid, it seems as though he can just say assign and wave his hand and then you're metal, which is pretty insane. So I think that both abilities broken, I guess, in their own rights. They have certain drawbacks, but once they can get them off, it seems, I don't know how Big Mom's going to get out of this, if she's going to get out of this. It did not seem like she's defeated this chapter. It does seem like this is just the initial introduction of their abilities. So I definitely look forward to seeing how a full back and forth goes between Big Mom versus these two characters as the fight plays out. So that's all for this video, and I will talk to you all next week.